Good afternoon, mesdames et messieurs. Welcome to Grady Hendrix Live. Welcome to the Final Girl Support Group. I'm sure you've seen Grady do live presentations of Fantasia over the years. He's always just brilliant with these shows. I've heard so many great things about this new one. I've not seen it yet performed. I've not yet read the book, which is one of the first things I'll be doing right when Fantasia ends. And I encourage you to as well, because it's sure to be incredible. Without further ado, please give it up to New York Times bestselling author Grady Hendrix. I love you, Grady. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Mitch. I appreciate it. And it is strange to be back, but I am really happy, even if I am nothing more than just a Free Jack style cyber avatar in people's faces.
Yeah, the virtual thing's unfortunate. I wish we could all be together in a big space with an audience. But those days will come back soon.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to turn the virtual stage over to you. I'm
right.
going to mute my mic and camera. Have a good set.
All right. I'm Grady. I'm the author of the Final Girl Support Group, and I hope you are all seeing my screen sharing right this minute. I think you are. And I am here. I am not really here, though. I am a voice in your headphones. I am a presence on your laptop screen. I can't see you, I can't hear you, but I know one thing about you. Old or young, American, Canadian, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, prefer not to answer. You do not want to get murdered. Ever since the invention of the printing press, we've been writing and selling books about murder. A lot of them have been about murder. Ever since we invented the motion picture camera, we have been making movies, and many of those, most of those, a majority of those have been about murder. You would think this means that we love murder, that we enroll our kids in after-school murder programs, that we spend our Friday nights making reservations at the hot new murder restaurant, that we go on vacation to murder parks. No, just the opposite. In fact, believe it or not, human beings spend a disproportionate amount of time trying not to get murdered. And you're saying to yourself, hey, Grady, you're right. I don't want to get murdered, but how? Ever since I got on Facebook, I've been worried about being murdered by pretty much everything, and I'm here to help. Ever since I was a small ginger child, I've been watching movies and reading books about murder, and I'm here tonight to tell you how not to get murdered. First, don't make friends. Friends get you to do things like sneak into a mall after hours where you'll be murdered by security robots, or sneak into a carnival after hours where you'll be murdered by the owners to form Monster Sun, or go camping where you'll be murdered by pretty much everything in the woods. Friends will invite you for trips to their yacht, or to visit their timeshare on the ski slopes, or attend a costume party. It sounds like a lot of fun. You'll die.
Grady,
friends love...
If I can interrupt you, you didn't start the screen sharing. Sorry.
Jesus. Yeah, okay, sorry. Sorry, y'all. I had the screen share running earlier and I didn't realize it was going to turn off. My apologies. So back to what we were saying. And let me just go back a little bit, actually. If you guys don't mind, I want to talk to you just a little bit about friends, but I feel like we should just all have our visual cues. Friends are going to get you. Actually, we'll start from where we are. Friends like to play pranks, which inevitably go wrong. Maybe they put a corpse in your bed and trick you into making out with it. Maybe they mischievously push you out a window to your death, or lure you in a bathroom, give you an ass's lace joints, and douse you with acid, leaving you disfigured, where you have to come back 10 years later and kill every single one of them. It's all a good laugh, but later you'll pay for it. Where friends are concerned, get a cat or not. Step 2, drop out of school if you don't want to get murdered. By 6th grade, you can read, write, do long division, and play the recorder. What else do you need? If you're smart, drop out then and there. Because if you want to do trig or AP American history or talk about the symbolism of the Great Gatsby, you will wind up dead. Whether it's a straightforward public high school like Central High or Crawford Academy, Montreal's elite academic institution. If you go to high school, you will be murdered. Boarding school is not a loophole. If you manage to survive high school and go to college, I don't want to be that guy, but you deserve what you get. But if you have a child who insists on attending college, and I understand, we often let our children do things just to make them shut up, and many children do want to go to university. Here's a quick tip sheet on the colleges to make your child not go to. Lanier College, Pritchard College, Wendell College, it had to be university, DeWitt University, St. Trinian's College, Windsor College. I've heard that some students who had survived Pendleton University thought it was a good idea to transfer to Alpine University. No. If by some miracle you actually do graduate from college, do not attend your class reunion unless you want to get impaled and blowtorched by a guy dressed as a magician. And if you think it doesn't apply to you because you'll be participating in Greek life, which offers a support network and safety in numbers, I admire your naivete. And also, avoid class reunions. And don't get me started on medical school. And third, and this is really important, this is probably the most important thing out there that I'm going to tell you tonight. Don't go anywhere. In fact, don't do anything. Don't go on vacation. If you go on vacation, don't go to Texas. Don't go to the supermarket. Don't go to the hospital. Don't park your car. Don't babysit. Don't play sports. Don't support sports. Don't go to the gym. Don't play paintball as a sport. Don't go to prom. Don't go to camp. Just stay home or not. And, I know it's a lot of stuff coming at you. We got off to a rocky start. I apologize. And you're sort of playing catch up right now. I understand. So let's start with something really, really basic. It's easy. You can do it today. Don't want to get murdered. Don't answer the phone. Phones are very, very bad. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's someone telling you the insurance on your car you don't own is about to expire. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's someone saying they want to murder you. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's your mom asking about an article she read on Facebook. Sometimes you answer the phone, it's a high-pitched digital noise that melts your brain. If you're a chandelier salesman named Chad who recently saved your beard, when you answer the phone, it's more often likely than not going to be a serial killer. Chad lives in Houston and has constructed a successful career selling what the author of Night Calls describes as things that could be constructed around one or more light bulbs. Human beings, we know them as lights. One night he receives a call on his phone. It's a serial killer who's torturing women to death. He makes Chad listen. This is so upsetting to Chad that when he calls the police and they send over Detective Sharon Reason, he immediately begins flirting with her because nothing gets you in the mood to seduce one woman more than listening to another woman get tortured for hours before being shotgunned in the face. Night after night, the night caller calls, getting more and more annoying and more deadly. Finally, Chad lets it go to the machine. This turns out to be a terrible idea. Once the killer realizes that Chad's screening his calls, he shotgun murders 5 people in a single evening to reinforce the notion to Chad that when the night caller calls, Chad needs to pick up. But it also turns out that the killer isn't actually murdering people. I mean, he is murdering people, but when the police psychiatrist shows up, he helpfully explains that the killer's shotgun is actually a penis, and when he pulls the trigger, he's actually ejaculating, and when people's brains splatter all over their wallpaper, he's actually impregnating them. But also, the psychiatrist in the book goes out to a bar with Chad, Detective Sharon Reason, then leaves them alone so they can enhance their personal relationship, hopefully not with a shotgun. Although you can see how in a dark room you might get that mixed up with your penis. Although, as the police psychiatrist points out, there are no dark rooms. There are only wombs. The police set clever traps to catch the night caller, like putting deep discounts on swanky chandeliers in the hopes that the killer will be drawn to these irresistible bargains. Chad, on the other hand, decides to use the radical strategy of actually listening to what the killer has to say, which is any woman who's ever gone out on a date with a man knows is highly unusual. Chad listens so hard that he uncovers the killer's primal hamster trauma that turned him into a serial killer in the first place. When the killer shows up at his latest victim's stylish condo, Chad gets there moments later because he tracked down the killer by finding the traumatized hamsters, and now he knows where he is. The police surround the condo with their guns drawn, trying to lure Chad into luring the killer outside so their sniper can lure a bullet through his brain with his penis. Or is that impregnate his brain with a shotgun? I get them confused. Chad is shocked and affronted by all this violence and instead uses his unnatural listening abilities to talk the killer into surrendering, promising him that he'll never be alone again and he'll get him all the help he needs to tell his penis from a shotgun again. And the killer listens, and Chad listens, and it's all very healthy and sane, and the book ends with the situation de-escalating in a totally non-macho way as the killer bursts into tears and Chad holds him while he cries, "I'm scared." "You don't need to be," Chad says. "I'm here now." Then he opens the door and begs the police not to frighten his new friend who has murdered 11 people. So the answer and the question we get from Nightcaller is the next time you want to answer the phone, send a letter or not. Primal hamster trauma, or as we like to call it in the trade, PHT, is only one reason people grow up to become serial killers. Sometimes they become serial killers because the little girl they liked in first grade crumpled up their Valentine's Day card and threw it on the floor. Sometimes they become serial killers because they saw their mothers murder their fathers. Sometimes they become serial killers because their mothers got mad at them for making the wrong jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes they get lost in the woods after their mothers die and turn into homicidal cavemen. But you'll notice these all have something in common. Every single one of these murderers becomes a murderer either because of something that happened when they were children or because of something children did to them. This is because in slasher movies, children are horrible. They taunt orphans, they crumple up Valentines and throw them on the floor. They set cabins on fire with handymen inside who get disfigured and have to come back 10 years later and murder everyone. So you get why murdering children is very, very popular with serial killers, like in Rockabye Baby. Look at that beautiful Lisa Falkenstern cover. Welcome to Goldsmith, Alabama. Maris McCready, seen here on the cover, is not just a serial killer pedophile, but he also pretends to be handicapped so he can use a discount handicap cab service and gets 10% off the Shoney's breakfast bar. As Dr. Loomis says in Halloween, true eyes of evil. Dressing as a nurse in an outfit he inherited from his sister, Maris prowls the Alabama woods, spying on little girls, asking to examine their swollen glands and strangling them. He calls himself the Blue Fur Lady, but he also calls himself Sister, and later he'll call himself the Beautiful Phantom, and everyone's like, make up your mind. So then for a while he calls himself Tootsie, after his favorite movie. Now it's PTA night, and Maris or Sister or Tootsie or the Blue Fur Lady knows that 15-year-old Todd will be babysitting his little sister while their parents are at the meeting, and Todd's idea of babysitting is to put Jessica in front of the television set and tell her to stay there while he retreated to his bedroom and blasted his psyche with Bruce Springsteen music. After murdering Jessica in front of the TV set, Maris retreats to his lair full of Garfield memorabilia. Who will stop this crazy Jim Davis fanatic? Prince Gannon, of course, a third grader with a rare blood condition that means all he gets for an after-school snack is one raw carrot. Prince's daddy is secretly dying of cancer, which we know because he recites the poetry of John Donne at the dinner table and says things like, well, son, I believe in the magic of the human spirit, which, as we all know, it's the only people who say those kind of things in books are people who are about to die. Prince has a magic girlfriend in the woods named Nandina, who has a hunchback, a withered arm, and wears a burlap dress. She lives with her Aunt Evie and is worried about something bad coming. Also, she is a ghost who can do magic. Meanwhile, Clay Lawrence, a tough cop from Atlanta, Georgia, is sent somehow to a rural Alabama to catch the killer, and suddenly the killer seems to be on a lunar cycle. Why? Probably because the author, Stephen Gresham, read Red Dragon, Thomas Harris's 1981 influential serial killer book, which is the introduction of the world to Hannibal Lecter. Why do I think that that Stephen Gresham read Thomas Harris's book? Well, it's not just the lunar cycle. It's the fact that Stephen Gresham reproduces entire scenes from Red Dragon in Rockabye Baby, only, stupid versions. Clay Lawrence, the cop from Atlanta, spends much of the book worried about what will happen to his comic book collection if he gets murdered by the Blue Fur Lady. So now we know what was going through Jodie Foster's mind in that serial killer's basement at the end of Silence of the Lambs. Clay's manner of investigation is just to wander around Alabama aimlessly until he arrests Alberto D'Angelo, a pedophile of the non-murdery variety who's living inside the ducts of the First Methodist Church. And you know what? I'm fine with that. It's a false arrest. I understand. However, the fewer pedophiles we have living in the HVAC systems of our Methodist churches, the better. Nandina, on the other hand, says, I'm telling you, boy, I'm more a little scared of this here killer. And she decides to investigate by actually investigating. So Prince demands that Nandina teach him shadow magic, which is too stupid for me to describe here, but basically she helps him shrink into a little sparkly ball of shadows and flies around town. Things come to a climax at the birthday party of Prince's other one-armed girlfriend. And I want to point out, it's a birthday party that's advertised for this third grader on the local radio station, which seems a touch unwise with the pedophile serial killer at large. Now, Bluefer/Marish/Tootsie/Sister is attracted to the birthday party after hearing about it on the radio, and he tries to abduct the little one-armed birthday girl. But Prince uses the shadow magic to make the Bluefer run away. However, he can't identify the killer because he can't remember what he looks like. And the police ask him, do you remember any details, son? Anything that'll help us catch this crazed madman? And Prince is like, I can't. I wish I could just think of one thing about his appearance, but he just looked like everyone else. And then 2 weeks later, Prince remembers. The killer was dressed as Garfield, the cat. Knowing they're on the lookout for someone with a larger than average collection of Garfield memorabilia, Nandina and Prince track down Bluefer, who is snuck into an elementary school classroom using his Star Wars lightsaber flashlight written, "Nobody gets out of here alive," on the chalkboard, urinated all over a list of classroom rules, stolen a scarf, tied it around his head, ripped it off, thrown it on the teacher's desk with a note that says, "Dear Madam Bitch, I am planning to strangle you with this scarf. Yours truly, the monster." Then he rubs a Raggedy Ann doll all over his body until he realizes that the reason a child beat him up at this third grader's birthday party is because he's trying to become a woman, and he needs to break the chains of gender and become the beautiful phantom, the phantom who is neither male nor female, a beautiful and powerful, sexless phantom. So Nandina and Prince use their shadow powers to track down Maris, and Nandina hypnotizes him with her spooky ghost lights, while Prince smacks him on both cheeks with hands dipped in hawk's blood. Then he tells Clay the cop to come, and Clay finds Bloofer in a room covered with the photos of the dead children with X's helpfully drawn over their faces. And whether he's Bloofer, Maris, Monster, Maris, sister, Tootsie, his own sister, or the beautiful Phantom, it turns out one thing all Maris's personalities have in common is a bullet allergy. But Cop Clay is haunted by killing another human being. And so he gives Prince his comic book collection, which I think is a suicide metaphor, and then he leaves town. Prince cures his daddy's blood cancer with his shadow magic, but ironically, it leaves him too weak to survive, and his own blood disease advances beyond a point where raw carrots can cure it. And since that seems to be the only medical treatment available in rural Alabama, Prince dies. Like you, this book left me with a lot of questions. The biggest one: why do murder books hate trans people? So sometimes a book changes everything. And in the case of murder books, the book that came along in 1988 that changed the entire field was Silence of the Lambs. Its game changer status was solidified a few years later when Jonathan Demme's film adaptation swept the 1991 Academy Awards, taking home Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, and making Anthony Hopkins a meme and a joke on The Simpsons. The movie's very familiar. I won't recap it here, but just in case any newborn infants are watching, I just want to bring them up to speed because they don't want to feel left out. So Silence of the Lambs is about an FBI agent hunting a serial killer with the assistance of another serial killer. The helpful serial killer is played by Anthony Hopkins. The bad serial killer is played by Ted Levine. The helpful serial killer eats his victims and murders many police officers over the course of the movie. The bad serial killer skins his victims and doesn't kill anyone during the running time of the film. However, we can tell the bad serial killer is bad because he wears makeup and says he wants to be a woman. During its initial release, the filmmakers waved away criticism from LGBT groups, saying that the bad serial killer wasn't gay and wasn't trans, he was just confused. We all bought it because probably we've been taught for decades that the way to spot the killer was to look for the guy wearing the dress. In 3 on a Meat Hook, the killer cross-dresses, just like Leatherface does at one point in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Cross-dressing and trans killers appear in Deranged, Relentless 3, Fatal Games, Dress to Kill. The entire climax of Sleepaway Camp consists of the Crying Game-style revelation that the killer is trans, which blew the minds of teenage boys everywhere. And murder books are as bad as murder movies. In Richard LaPlante's Steroid Blues, we meet Jack Dunn, a bodybuilder who lives in a depressing house in Philly where he takes a lot of steroids, prays a lot, gobbles Valium, but also meth, so it's confusing. His hobbies are pumping iron until his muscles hurt and then screaming, help me, in an increasingly high-pitched voice into the random phone calls. He also has a beard, lots of body hair from all the steroids he's shooting, and a wiener that's constantly flopping out the side of his little bodybuilder trunks and hanging down to his knees like a, quote, brown, oversized earthworm. Jack Dunn loves to dress up as his dead sister, Jacqueline, and you see where this is going. It's no surprise when we learn that Jack Dunn's other hobby besides weightlifting is punching people to death. It turns out that his sister, Jacqueline Dunn, was also a bodybuilder who used to go to Animals, a gym run by Horst Nichols, a neo-Nazi powerlifting steroid dealer whom we first meet cracking open frozen monkey skulls on the edge of his desk and sucking out their raw glandular fluid. Horst wears a black and red spandex unitard with an enormous pair of prosthetic silicone testicles sewn into the crotch, and he's German, so he says fun things like, what's happening here, and get out of my fucking bag. He also seems to have sex murdered Jacqueline. But then it turns out that Jack Dunn isn't Jacqueline Dunn's brother. And it turns out that Jacqueline Dunn wasn't a steroid-addicted gym bunny sex murdered by Horst Nichols. It turns out that Jacqueline Dunn was a cop sent to Horst's gym to bust his steroid ring, but he got inside her head and turned her into this steroid-crazed workout holic. And he got her to get off his case by killing her brother, and that made her quit. So Jack Dunn is actually Jacqueline Dunn, who is hooked on steroids and has grown enormous muscles, a thick mat of body hair, a full beard, and that brown oversized earthworm that hangs down to her knees. It's her clitoris. Because you know what happens when you go to the gym too much, ladies? You turn into a man. This anti-trans trope is way too pervasive to spring out of nowhere. But where? Neither transsexuals nor transvestites make the FBI's list of serial killer profiles, so it doesn't reflect reality. You follow this toxic trail back far enough, and you kind of feel like you've arrived at Psycho in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock's zeitgeist-changing story about Norman Bates, a serial killer who dresses his mother, who's looking for love at a tiny motel and getting into all kinds of crazy hijinks. But behind Hitchcock's movie is Robert Bloch's book, Psycho. The book and the movie are very close together. The main difference being that in the book of Psycho, Norman Bates is an obese, middle-aged creep who's obsessed with his mother, whereas in the movie, he's young and handsome Anthony Perkins who's obsessed with his mother. Bloch got the idea for Psycho when he was 41 years old with no money, no prospects, stalled writing career, trapped in a tiny Wisconsin town. And then Ed Gein happened. A local Wisconsin boy, Gein was arrested for murder in 1957, and when police searched his house, they discovered it stuffed with trophies and accessories made from the skin and bones of his victims, and multiple bodies that Gein had exhumed from a local cemetery. Ed Gein went down in history as a necrophiliac transvestite who wore women's skin and kept his mother's corpse in the basement. The only problem with that, Gein wasn't a necrophile, he wasn't a transvestite, he didn't have his mother's corpse in the basement, but he did wear women's skin, so 1 out of 4. All these ideas seem to have sprung from this 8-page Life magazine article that threw in the line that Ed Gein wished he were a woman. The only catch? A psychiatrist hadn't even examined Gein when the article was written. As the local crime lab director said, "That's news to me." Life seems to have gotten this idea that Ed Gein wanted to be a woman from the Milwaukee Journal's coverage, which wrote about Gein's unnatural attachment to his mother, quoting an unidentified investigator. Now, that investigator was unidentified, probably because he didn't exist. The Milwaukee Journal also got an armchair psychiatrist who'd never met Gein to claim that Gein wished he had been born a woman instead of a man and shows symptoms of acute transvestitism. The actual psychiatric profile of Ed Gein, the one not written to sell newspapers, had nothing to say about transvestitism or cross-dressing or his mother's corpse for that matter. All the cross-dressing talk seems to derive from a single polygraph transcript in which the operator, Joe Wilimovsky, suggested to Gein several times that he enjoyed wearing women's clothing and body parts. "That could be," Gein said cheerfully, and suddenly he was a transvestite who wanted to be a woman for the rest of eternity. This is a good place to note that in Gein's psychiatric profile, they note that he was highly suggestible and had a hard time telling the difference between things that actually happened and things he had been told had happened. So why did Wilimovsky, though, insert cross-dressing into Gein's story? Well, the late 1950s saw America getting increasingly hysterical over crime. The juvenile delinquent was the most terrifying figure in public, and Senate had recently had hearings on how comic books turned good boys bad. Within months of Gein's arrest, Charles Starkweather went on a shooting spree in the Midwest for reasons no one could understand, followed by the apparently motiveless Clutter killings that led to the book and movie In Cold Blood. Then came the 1960 arrest of serial killer Melvin Rees, and everyone wanted to know, why were white dudes suddenly murdering everyone for no good reason? The obvious answer? Their mothers. A psychiatric theory making the rounds in the 40s and 50s, which was espoused most prominently in this bestseller, Generation of Vipers, that came out in 1942, said that if mothers showed too much affection for their sons, it turned them into criminals and sexual deviants. If your mother was too close to you, there was a good chance you would be a sissy. As Philip Wiley said in his book, "Mom's first gracious presence at the ballot box was roughly concomitant with the start towards a new all-time low in political scurviness, hoodlumism, gangsterism, labor strife, monopolistic thuggery, moral degeneration, civic corruption, smuggling, bribery, theft, murder, homosexuality, drunkenness, financial depression, chaos, and war." Jesus Christ, Mom, cut it out. Robert Moskin's 1958 article in Look was called "The American Male, Why Do Women Dominate Him?" Richard Green published a study called The Sissy Boy Syndrome in 1987 based on research he'd begun back in 1953, trying to identify why some boys grew up to be gay or trans. And he laid it all at the feet of their moms. Unlike fathers, a mother's involvement and investment with sons must be only temperate. It must be finely tuned to provide the son with security and emotional warmth. There must be just enough of mother to round off the hard edges carved by father. She must not smother, stifle, or feminize. Incidentally, the psychiatric profile of the Boston Strangler developed by the police to help catch him in the early 60s cast him as a probable homosexual and his mother as punitive and overwhelming. As late as 1980, the DSM claimed that mothers who hug their sons too much turn them trans. And so there you have it. A busted psychiatric theory about how mothers made their sons gay and trans and criminals got shoehorned into the case against Ed Gein by eager psychiatrists, and then made it into Robert Bloch's novel based on the Gein case, which wound up in Alfred Hitchcock's hit movie based on Bloch's book, which flowed out like a poisonous river, leaving its rancid traces on dozens, if not hundreds, of serial killer books and slasher movies. It's an idea that persists today, even among people who probably should know better. When you Google Ed Gein, most current articles describe him as a mama's boy, as you see here on this branded merch, who was ruined by his domineering mother. A narrative that totally leaves out the fact that, according to Gein and his brother, his father was an alcoholic nightmare who abused both of them physically for years. Fun fact, the Boston Strangler also had an alcoholic, deeply abusive father, but why pay attention to that? After all, as we all know, everything is always mom's fault. So, children and moms, both to be completely avoided if you don't want to get killed or turn into a killer. Who else becomes the killer? Well, if you're from a mutant cannibal redneck family, you will probably be a killer or meet a killer if you hang out with them long enough. Also killers, escapees from mental hospitals, avoid those. Also killers, overly competitive people. And this one really doesn't get as much attention as it should, because whether you're an actor who really wants a role, a mascot who wants to be a cheerleader, or an Olympic athlete who's taken steroids and transitioned from male to female so you can win in women's events and you're also murdering people to cover up your secret, competitive people are terrible. But some people kill because they blame everyone else for their problems. Pamela Voorhees kills because Camp Crystal Lake, because she blames the counselors totally irrationally for the drowning death of her son, Jason. Then Jason grows up to murder campers and counselors for the murder of his mother in the previous movie. And I get it. He loves his mom. He's mad she got decapitated. But by the time you get to Friday the 13th, part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, you really begin to feel like Jason sort of lost his place a little bit. I get it. It's easy to blame other people for your problems, but I want to take a minute right here while we're just having this time together to tell you that if you were rescuing someone who got injured while skiing and you broke your leg in the process, thereby ending your Olympic dreams, it doesn't make any sense to wait 10 years later to invite all that guy's friends to a timeshare on the ski slopes and murder them one by one with snowplows and icicles. If your family died in a fire started by an insane cult leader who locked the doors of the movie theater while showing a short film and burned everyone to death and burned you beyond recognition, it is not okay to track down his daughter years later and murder everyone who's attending her all-night horror movie marathon. People, stay focused, accept responsibility. You are the captain of your own ship. But there is one killer who it's not their fault. There is one killer who is totally blameless for killing. One killer who kills because he doesn't know any better. He kills because teenagers broke into his home. He kills because he doesn't know any other way. And I'm talking, of course, about deformed monster sons. It's now time to kill a teen. They broke in on a dare. You are deformed. That's not your fault. We are mutant inbred scum. Abduct a girl, howl a little. If you want, you two can marry. Obey me. I am old, but I'm your daddy. You scream and carry on. And I know that it's not easy to be calm when you found teenagers in your safe space. Take your time and kill them slow. Maybe gnaw their flesh a little, for you will still be here tomorrow, but these teens will not. How can I try to explain? When I do, they run away again. It's always been the same story. Since I was born, I can't talk, kept chained up in the basement. I don't want to kill anyone, but I don't know my own strength. Daddy keeps you on a chain because look, you're killing teens again. You've got the mind of a child in the body of a man. You're too strong, that's not your fault. And your skull, it is misshapen. Settle down in your straw and stop making all that noise. All the times that I've cried, keeping all the feelings I feel inside. Don't they know I'm more scared of them than they're scared of me? I have broken my own chains and packed up my stuffed animals. I'd rather be in something PG like the Goonies. And I know I have to go, and I know I have to go away. Normal or deformed, blaming other people for their problems, or just overly competitive. People have been killing people for thousands of years, but tonight we're not talking about our everyday murder slobs. We're talking about big time, big name, bold-faced celebrity killers. So let's hop in the Wayback Machine, shift gears, and talk about murder's first big celebrity killer, Jack the Ripper. The Ripper killed 5 people between August and November of 1888, but he wasn't England's first serial killer. That was Mary Ann Cotton. He wasn't even Victorian England's first serial killer who was murdering prostitutes in London. That was Dr. Thomas Crean. But Jack the Ripper is the first slasher, and he helped set the template. Newspaper advertisers paid for premium placement to ensure that their ads appeared on the same pages as illustrations of the Ripper's victims, who were always depicted nude, dead, and with unrealistically perky and unblemished breasts on full display for readers for journalistic integrity. Jack the Ripper had a great name because he named himself, and no one knew who he was, which was even better. Newspapers claimed he was a Russian anarchist, a policeman, a Native American, a sailor, and a cowboy, which basically meant he was the 19th century village people. There were theories that he was a mad doctor, a religious fanatic, an upper-class erotic maniac, a sociologist seeking to wake London up to the plight of its poor by killing them, a woman, a corrupt cop, and Jews. All Jews, every Jew, basically. Even Queen Victoria wrote Scotland Yard her own private personal psychological profile of Jack the Ripper, saying he was a sailor. The first modern day murder book appeared in October 1888 between Ripper Murders number 4 and 5, when John Francis Brewer wrote the first Jack the Ripper fan fiction, The Curse upon Mitre Square, in which he claimed that the Ripper was the ghost of a 16th century monk who killed his sister on the altar of a church and now haunted Whitechapel to this day as the incarnation of pure evil. Reviewers called his book thrilling and condensed as a meat lozenge. In 1889, a man known only as Rhodesi, who wrote Lord Jacqueline Berkeley, the Whitechapel Terror, about a man named, not surprisingly, Lord Jacqueline Berkeley, who had a split personality that was the Whitechapel Terror. There was The Whitechapel Murders, or an American detective in London, in which a Pinkerton detective goes to London to solve the Ripper murders. Then Jack the Ripper in New York, in which the Ripper goes to New York City to commit more murders. There were fictional first-person Jack the Ripper diaries published in Scandinavia, Flemish Jack the Ripper plays, and even by Jack the Aufschlitzer Gestatt Word, in which Sherlock Holmes captures the Ripper in a German novel. In 1911, Jack the Ripper fan fiction went mainstream when Marie Belloc Lowndes wrote her short Ripper novel, The Lodger, published in McClure's magazine. Gertrude Stein loved it, Ernest Hemingway loved it, and Alfred Hitchcock turned it into a hit silent movie in 1926. He would later make it a radio play in America in 1940 and spent many years trying to do an American adaptation, but ultimately couldn't clear the rights and had to settle for making other movies about men killing women. So how did we get from Jack the Ripper to now? How do we get from this to this? It all comes down to one number, Z500-599. So did you guys hear the thing? This is a story that's going around about this babysitter. Okay, so my sister's best friend was babysitting these kids on Halloween, and the guy escaped from a mental hospital and like put on a mask and went back to his hometown and like killed a bunch of people. And the babysitter killed him, but like they totally never found his body. So he's like still out there. Yeah, okay, I know. But actually, before that, my brother's girlfriend has a cousin who was in a sorority at a college in Canada where they call it university. And one Christmas, everyone had gone home, but some of the girls hadn't left yet. And they started getting these weird phone calls from a really crazy guy who killed a bunch of them. And then the police traced the calls and told the last girl left alive not to go upstairs because the calls were coming from inside the house. Okay, I know. But actually before that, this woman I work with, her mom's best friend's daughter's guidance counselor's sister's niece was babysitting in California, and she started getting phone calls from this crazy guy, and the cops traced it and told her to get out of the house because the calls were coming from inside the house. And then she ran upstairs to get the kids, and the killer came after her with a knife, and she brained him with the freezer door, and then she ran outside where the cops were just showing up, and they shot him to death. That last one is Foster's Release, a 14-minute student film from 1971 made at USC Film School by Terrence Winkless, a man at that point who was most famous for playing Bingo the Gorilla on the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. Foster's Release played twice publicly. The Edinburgh Film Festival and a USC Film Festival, where it was almost definitely watched by one of Winkless's classmates, John Carpenter, who would go on to make Halloween in 1978. But Foster's release was also distributed all across America as a short film shown in high school home economics classes to initiate a discussion of babysitting responsibilities and crisis response. As the film's booking materials claimed, beyond the chilling entertainment value of the film, the girl's handling of the situation exemplifies decisive action in a threatening situation. Foster's release might just be ground zero in the modern day slasher film, but it's not. The slasher actually goes back to a specific urban legend floating around since the 60s known as the babysitter and the man upstairs, in which a babysitter gets threatening phone calls and the police trace them back and find out that the calls are coming from inside the house. Slasher movies draw on this urban legend and others to create our faceless killers, tapping into sort of our collective unconsciousness. And the babysitter and the man upstairs is one of three that shape the genre. In Ernest Bauman's landmark type and motif index of the folk tales of England and North America, these urban legends are classified under serial number Z500 to 599, covering horror stories, which are not ghost or witch stories, but which are told because of the effect of horror they produce in the listener. Usually the emphasis is not on the supernatural, but on the grisly or strange. So there's a babysitter and the man upstairs, but then earlier than that, there's one called The Roommate. So The Roommate is about these roommates in college and everyone's going home for the holiday, pick your holiday, whatever it is. And one goes out and one stays home. And the one who stays home wakes up in the middle of the night and hears this horrible gurgling and scratching on the door. So she goes and locks it. And then she wakes up the next morning, opens the door, and her roommate's lying dead on the floor of the hall with her throat slit by some escaped maniac. And that was her trying to get in the night before. Now, there's another version where we go with the roommate who goes out and she goes out and she comes home late. And there's a note on the door that says, don't turn on the lights. And she assumes her roommate's asleep. And so she goes in and leaves the lights off. She gets into bed, goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, the sun comes up, and she sees written in blood over her roommate's dead body in bed, aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights? There are 31 variations on The Roommate collected since 1961, but there is one urban legend even earlier and far more primal than that. And it all has to do with Dear Abby. So on Tuesday, November 8th, 1960, a letter appeared in the syndicated Dear Abby column and newspapers all over America that read, Dear Abby, if you're interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose for me. A fellow and his date pulled into their favorite lover's lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who served time for rape and robbery. He was described as having a hook instead of a right hand. The couple got really scared and they drove away. When the boy took the girl home, he went around the car, opened the car door for her, and then he saw it, a hook hooked into her door handle, ripped off the maniac's arm. I mean, I don't think I'll ever park and make out again as long as I live. I hope this does the same for the other kids. Yours truly, Jeanette. This is the story of the hook, which has been recorded by folklorists as early as 1951. The folklore archives at the University of California, Berkeley hold 70 different regional versions of the hook. And the hook has everything that a slasher movie will eventually have. Teenagers in the woods or some desolate spot trying to have sex, getting attacked by an unseen, unnamed killer with an unusual weapon, the hook, and from that drawing the conclusion they should never have sex again. Researchers in the 50s and 60s found versions of the hook in Maryland, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Oregon, Canada, Utah, and New Mexico, but it's not that simple. So the earliest recorded outbreak of hook stories sprung up in Los Angeles in 1947 and 48 during a citywide reign of terror by someone known only as the Red Light Bandit. And he was an unidentified man who terrorized lovers' lanes, committing a series of robberies and sexual assaults on young couples who'd gone out there to park, using a red spotlight mounted on his car to make them think he was a cop. The police eventually arrested Carol Chessman, and he was sentenced to death thanks to the creative application of an anti-kidnapping law that applied to him because he had dragged one of his victims 22 feet from her car. Chessman was a publicity hound who maintained his innocence right up until the end. And he wrote and published 4 bestsellers while in prison, one of which got made into a movie in 1955. And sociologists point to a surge in hook stories in 1960, the same year Chessman was very publicly and very controversially executed. So Carl Chessman became the hook And the hook helped spawn The Roommate and The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. And these urban legends became Foster's release in 1971, and Black Christmas in 1974, and Halloween in 1978. And that opened the floodgates for the golden age of the slasher from 78 to 84, when 150 slashers hit the big screen in 6 years, starting with Halloween, and then Friday the 13th, the Nail Gun Massacre, the Microwave Massacre, the Toolbox Murders, the Icebox Murders. And as the golden age ended in 84, the slashers just kept coming, and they began to embrace the fact that their main characters were usually teenagers, and they appealed to younger and younger and younger audiences who always wanted to watch up, until finally slashers got so young that we arrive here. Slasher YA and middle grade books that came out at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, aimed at 11 and 12-year-old readers as Jason and Michael Myers murdered teenagers for their reading entertainment pleasure. The next step after slashers got super young is that serial killers got superpowers, making them far more powerful and far beyond the reach of us normal everyday slobs like you and me. Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs had already given us Hannibal Lecter in 88, a smarty pants doctor with maroon eyes and 6 fingers on his hands, who essentially has ESP. And he fit right in with Freddy Krueger, the superpowered Scarface dead pedophile who killed people in their dreams at the height of the slasher boom. And they would inspire other superpowered serial killers like Temple Galt and Patricia Cornwell's best-selling book series, a gay super hacker karate expert serial killer who loves uniforms, or Rex Miller's Chain Gun Bankowski and his Slob series, a 400-pound super serial killer who can turn invisible and regulate his heart rate that lets him, slip around like a ninja. He has a genius level intellect, is a physical precognitive, understands fluid mechanics, and is immune to poison ivy. With these superhuman serial killers roaming around, we needed superhero cops to catch them. And fortunately, Thomas Harris invented those too in his 1981 Red Dragon, where he introduced us to FBI profiler Will Graham, a dude so dedicated to catching serial killers that he gets all up inside their heads, man, until he thinks like they do. Graham kicked off a whole slew of mind hunters, and they're real. The FBI's behavioral science unit, established in 1971, was so good at mind hunting that at their peak, they were sending out 600 criminal profiles to police departments across America that resulted in 5 arrests. That's a under 2.7% success rate. They were so good at serial killing that one massive study of metadata showed that the FBI profilers were only marginally better, within 1 percentage point, than people off the street of predicting future crimes based on psychological profiles. But that didn't stop writers who needed these Batman super profilers to fight their Joker super serial killers. Fictional profilers are, the best way to describe them is dedicated men with strong convictions who come to small towns where evil has been done. And these men examine the crime scene, and their training and their faith in science lets them see clues that no one else could see. And they use those clues to construct the identity of the killer hiding among normal people undetected, hoping to catch them before they strike again. You know who else did that? Not FBI psychological profilers. FBI psychological profilers spent most of their time in cubicles typing reports. The other people who did that were witch hunters, men of faith and conviction, who went to small towns, who went and examined crime scenes and saw clues that only they could perceive thanks to their religious training, that let them reconstruct the identity of the witches hiding among the other people undetected, hoping to stop these agents of evil before they struck again. These these profilers don't come any more dedicated than Dr. Dean Grant, star of Dead Man's Float. Medical examiner for the city of Chicago, Dr. Dean Grant is a tall man with a reddish mustache and light dancing in his blue-gray eyes. Tell me more. His experience with human frailties, human viciousness, had jaded him into an outwardly casual cynicism that was, in truth, deep-seated, running amok at times to the point where he had few friends. Sounds haunted. In his professional life, he often displayed calm, controlled, and yet passionate concern for the job at hand, often spilling over into a madman's obsession. Sounds passionate. When local cops in Indiana find 12-year-old Laura Baines dead, floating face down in an Indiana lake. They all tell him that Laura, like many seventh graders in Indiana, has just killed herself out of despair. But then Dr. Dean Grant blows their mind by being all, seventh grade is too young to fold your clothes this neatly and stack them so precisely by the shore. Someone else was here with little Laura. Minds blown. The cops back off, leaving Dr. Grant to crouch over the pile of Laura's clothes, murmuring, Laura, little girl, you're priority number one. Priority number one. Driven, obsessed, dedicated, Dr. Grant even cancels anniversary plans with his long-suffering wife, Jackie, who cries on the phone, Christ, Dean, so what? Another floater. There's always another floater. There was one yesterday, there'll be one tomorrow. Floaters, always has been a floater, always will be a floater. Which seems a little harsh since we're talking about a dead 12-year-old child, but that doesn't bother Dean Grant, who will solve this floater crime with science. But how? There are no clues. Aha. As Dr. Dean Grant says to the astonished local constabulary, anything is possible in forensic medicine. And it is, because author Robert Walker just makes it all up. First, Dr. Grant sprays the dirt around the clothes with Seconal. Most of us think of Seconal as a powerful sedative, but are we doctors? Dr. Dean Grant knows that Seconal will glow in the dark wherever it touches moisture, revealing telltale blood stains. Later, he'll use an infrared photography to detect footsteps in a puddle of water, not in the dirt at the bottom of the puddle of water, in the actual puddle. Then he'll employ a small nuclear reactor to create the killer's hair chart based on a clipping of their hair, which apparently is unique as their fingerprints. Dr. Dean Grant can scrape condensed human breath off of plastic bags, and he can get you to breathe on a microscope slide, then put that slide into the tracer, which bombards it with laser beams, that turns it into a liquid, that lets him analyze it so he'll know everything you ate or drank that day. I don't know, is that how breathing works? Maybe, maybe not, but it's science. The same science that describes bourbon as a chemical and napalm as a poison gas. But Dr. Dean Grant doesn't just rely on science. He also has the almost superhuman ability to detect when people are lying, although his detector wasn't any more reliable and even less admissible as evidence than a polygraph, but it was faster and surer. So, not very reliable, not admissible as evidence, but it's fast and sure. Get those witches to the stake, stat. It turns out, using science, that Dr. Dean Grant discovers that little Laura is the victim of a conspiracy by a girl who's possessed by her failed Catholic priest's dead brother's spirit. And these sinister conjoined supernatural siblings are drowning people to wash them of their sins before they send them to Jesus. And they've been doing this for years in cities across America, and dumb local cops who don't have access to a man of science who whispers to close like Dr. Dean Grant have just been labeling all their crimes as accidents, like a bunch of dummies. In later adventures, Dr. Dean Grant encounters an obese deli butcher who faints at the sight of blood and communes with the astral spirit of King Solomon when he gets high by huffing the breath of his victims he traps inside plastic bags and asphyxiates over the course of several hours. He also battles a maniac armed with a laser blowtorch who hates eyes because that's how his mother's spirit enters women, and he has to burn them all out to try to kill the disembodied ghost of his mom. But no enemy tests Dr. Dean Grant as deeply as the one he encounters when he goes to Orlando, Florida in Razor's Edge and falls in love. There's a serial killer at work in Orlando who's scalping his victims alive, and Dr. Dean Grant is invited to assist. There he meets Dr. Ben Hamill, a police psychiatrist. When Dr. Grant meets him, the two men shake each other's hands like doctors, firmly, each caught in the other's gaze. And then Dr. Dean Grant keeps thinking about how handsome Dr. Hamill is, remarking repeatedly that he looks just like Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine. Super sexy. Dr. Hamill looks so much like Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine that Dr. Dean Grant cannot say no when he invites him to dinner. There, Dr. Hamill says, "Do you mind if I call you Dean?" And Dr. Grant blushes and stammers, "No." And Dr. Hamill insists he call him Ben. And then after telling Dean that he knows the scalpings are the work of two serial killers working as a team, because if you look over serial killing, the worst ones tend to be two people or more, which totally isn't true at all. They have a final parting manly handshake, and Ben holds onto Dean's hand for a long time, caressing it. Cursed with a gay boner, Dr. Grant receives a lucky break when Carson, a tough lady cop, is attacked by the scalper, but escapes. She confirms that it's not just two men working together, but One of them is a midget. That should narrow down the suspects because, as Dr. Grant notes, it simply was not likely that two separate man and dwarf murder teams could be at work in the same city. Using irresponsible leaps in logic and totally fabricated forensic medicine, Dr. Dean Grant learns that this man and dwarf murder team's dwarf is Van, a lizard-eating hairy dwarf who's kept chained in the basement by his parents as a child where rats nibbled off his ears. He has a double row of teeth like a shark, and he dresses like, quote, a Dickensian street urchin. His entire body is covered in hair, more hair than most men grow in a lifetime. His ears grow hair, his forehead grows hair, his back and shoulders grow hair, his buttocks grow hair. Ironically, the one part of his body that doesn't grow hair is the top of his head. In order to please Satan, who loves hair and has promised to make him a dark wizard when he's completely covered in hair, Van the dwarf and his brother are looking for a scalp they can turn into a toupee that will fool the Prince of Darkness. That partner, Dr. Ben Hamill. Van is Dr. Hamill's brother, and Dr. Hamill worships Van because of his all-powerful hair. Because see, Dr. Hamill has very little body hair, and so he eats big bowls of hair stew and rubs gel made from the fat of his victims all over his body so he'll absorb their DNA, and that's totally not how DNA works. But when his brother starts going on about wanting to scalp babies, Dr. Hamill is all like, I don't think that's a good idea. And Van's like, you don't do the thinking around here, cue ball. And he beats Dr. Hamill senseless with a bullwhip made of braided human hair. And I think now's the time to tell you these two brothers are also total and complete nuts for the music of Bob Seger. It all ends with brother on brother scalping and Dean versus dwarf wrestling matches, climaxing when the brothers are eaten by an alligator, which is a member of the Orlando PD calls a fitting Florida end for that tiny little man. And as we bring our time together tonight to a fitting Florida end, I want to talk to you finally about my book, The Final Girl Support Group. And it's taken me a while to get here. And I'm sorry, almost as long as it took me to write this book, because the first file of this book, the first draft got written on January 9th of 2014. But I actually started working on this book 40 years ago in 1981. So as a kid, I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies. I read the Marvel comic book adaptations of Alien, or I read Mad Magazine parodies of R-rated movies like Jaws, and that was always hard if I wanted to pretend I'd seen the R-rated movie in question, because like if you read the parody, you're going to get stuff wrong. So I had to be very careful with that. But I didn't want people to think I was a loser who wasn't allowed to see R movies. So I would just try to piece it together from various sources, and then I came up with a master solution. After Cub Scout meetings, we'd go across the street to the Oasis gas station and buy snacks. And I convinced my Scoutmaster that I was allowed to buy magazines with my snack money because, you know, reading is good. The first magazine I picked up was Fangoria number 12, April 1981. And I read their feature story on the opening scene of Friday the 13th, part 2, and it blew my mind. I read it over and over again. If you don't remember the movie, so Alice Hardy, played by Adrienne King, is the final girl from the original Friday. And now at the beginning of part 2, she's chilling in this crummy apartment on a rainy night, having nightmares, wearing these wacky plaid overalls, drawing pictures of Jason, jumping at loud noises, arguing with her mom on the phone, trying to get better, when out of nowhere, Jason appears and ice picks her in the head. She went through all that savagery and bloodshed in part 1, saw all her friends killed, decapitated Ms. Voorhees, trying to put her life back together again, maybe drawing too many pictures of Jason, but you know, whatever works for you. And they just wipe her out. The casual cruelty of that hit me hard as a kid. You think it's just another Wednesday night in Albany, but really you're in the sequel. There is no escape, there is no mercy. You're not a person, you are a body count. And I always wanted to rewrite that moment to give her a happier ending. So 40 years later, I've written the Final Girl Support Group, and I get Adrienne King's email from my friend Ted, and I get in touch with her, and I send her a copy of the book because I'm like, oh, it'd be cool to get blurbs for the book of Final Girls, like saying they like the book. So Adrienne really likes the book, and she calls me up, and we start talking, and I tell her about that issue of Fango and Friday the 13th, part 2, and the impact it made, and Adrienne tells me this story. So when Adrienne made Friday the 13th, part 2, she was about 23. She'd had fun making the first one, and she really wanted to do the second, but she told the producers, look, I'm having some personal issues. We might just have to work around that. It's no big deal. I'm sure we can make it work. So eventually she gets a call and shows up on set, assuming she's the star of Friday the 13th, part 2, and it's the first day of shooting. In reality, it's the last day of production. They don't give her a script, no sides, but that's not a big deal to her. Like, they improvised a lot of the first movie, you know, and it's a Friday movie, you know, they'll get it. She'll make it up as they go along. They'll give her pages. It's all good. So they put her in this apartment, you know, get her to improvise a phone call with her mom, react to a noise outside. Oh, you see something scary, walk around, it's a rainy night. And she doesn't know what's about to happen until the stuntman playing Jason stabs her in the side of the head with a fake ice pick. Now you can see it in the movie. Friday the 13th films are not shy about their kills, but there is a single shot of Adrian getting an ice pick in the head. No elaborate gore rig, no shot of her dead body, one and done. Because once they did it, the cat was out of the bag and Adrian probably wouldn't shoot anymore. The personal issue she was having at the time was that she had a stalker. This guy was nameless, he was faceless. He followed her wherever she went in public and took pictures of her. He took pictures of her in nightclubs where she thought she was safe because she was with friends. He took pictures of her having coffee with her friends. He took pictures of her in changing rooms. He took pictures everywhere, and he would leave them on the doorstep of her apartment in a doorman secured building. He could get in anywhere. He was everywhere. He was nowhere. He told her that no one would ever believe her if she reported him. It got so bad that she had to put a deadbolt lock on the inside of her bathroom door to feel safe enough to take a shower. When that nameless, faceless stuntman playing Jason sunk that fake ice pick into the side of her head, Adrian didn't know what was going on, but suddenly the shoot wrapped, they put her in the car, drive her back to a motel and drop her off and left her there, totally isolated, completely cut off and all alone. I wrote the Final Girl support group partly because I wanted to write a happier ending for a final girl I'd seen in a magazine 40 years ago, but I also wrote it because I was starting to wonder what was wrong with me. Like, I love horror movies. I've been watching them most of my life. And that means I've spent 40 years watching people get murdered for my fun. And that's weird. And so I wanted to know what I was doing. What was this all about? And it's interesting with slasher movies because we think of them as these campy artifacts from the 80s, you know, little nostalgia nuggets that are sort of, you know, fun and comforting and corny. But slasher movies are the real life, modern day, all-American horror story. A heavily armed man walks through a supposedly safe place like a spa or a school, and he methodically kills everyone he can find one by one. Get a little more existential? And maybe you're some guy who read about a horror movie in a magazine 40 years ago, and now you're writing the end of this book in August of 2020 during the second wave of the pandemic, huddled behind locked doors and windows, suspicious that any stranger you meet might wind up making you dead, totally isolated, completely cut off, and all alone. And outside, there's a faceless killer stalking all the places we used to go, all our supposedly safe spaces, summer camps, gyms, supermarkets. Everything we did for fun is gone. No more prom, no more sports, no more vacations. You don't go to a hospital trying to get better. You go to a hospital now because that's where you die. College dorms lie empty, frat houses, sorority houses, abandoned, elementary schools, high schools, all empty. The only thing walking out there is something that wants us dead. And I realized as I wrote the end of this book that I love a nihilistic ending as much as the next maladjusted weirdo. I mean, I love The Dorm That Dripped Blood, right? But the horror movies I really love, the ones I come back to over and over again, were the ones that had final girls in them. The ones where these women burst into the room with their big sister energy and they grab our hands and they say, run. And so we run. We run through the dark woods, all of us, filling the space between the trees. We're running at full speed, tripping and falling down and getting up over and over again. And we can't stop. We can't turn around because the killer is right behind us with a machete or a butcher's knife or a chainsaw or a pizza cutter or an icicle or a coronavirus. And the woods are full of us and we're all running. And imagine this is a shot in the movie. And if we just pull back and get a wider angle, we see the killers right behind us, the Jasons and the Freddys and the Michaels and the Normans and the Ted Bundys and the Ed Geins and that guy from the bar who just won't take no for an answer, and that stalker and that drunk driver and that building inspector. And we pull back further and we see that behind them are their monsters chasing them, their abusive fathers, their schoolyard bullies, their poverty, their dead too soon parents, their closed skull injuries, their alcoholic grandparents. And we go back further, and we see their monsters right on their heels, and there's monsters back and back and back, all the way until we see the one monster coming for all of us in his hooded robe, carrying a scythe. And then we reverse, and that shot turns, and we look up ahead of us, and the trees are thinning, and we're coming to the edge of the woods, and we can see the sky, and it's getting lighter, and we realize we made it. We're going to survive, and behind us are the ones we left behind, the ones we lost, our grandparents, that girl from work you talked to a few times, our great aunts, all those hundreds and thousands of people who died in nursing homes, who died in ICUs, who died alone, but we survived. At any second, the credits are going to roll, and we made it. And we made it one more day, and we didn't have to be strong. We didn't have to be smart. We didn't have to have a master plan or a handgun with good stopping power or a finely honed sense of danger. All we had to do was just not stop. That's how you don't get murdered. Because every day is a horror movie. And the next day is always waiting for us, because what we've learned is there's always a sequel. And all we have to do is keep running. All we have to do is get up when we fall down. All we have to do is not quit. And so we survive the original and the sequel and the threequel and all the spin-offs. My Dumb Fucking Life, part 14,603, the final chapter, part 2. Adrian didn't die in that motel room where they dropped her off after she got ice picked in Friday the 13th, part 2. Her stalker didn't get her. She kept going. She didn't stop. She left New York, she headed out west, she did some stunts in Ghostbusters, and she started a career doing dialogue looping and voiceover recording. And if you've seen Titanic or Jerry Maguire or Philadelphia or Mouse Hunt, you've heard Adrian's voice, this secret final girl hidden in the soundtrack. She runs a winery now, and 40 years after a kid in a Cub Scout uniform stood in an Oasis gas station wishing he could write a different ending for this 23-year-old woman he'd never met, we met. And Adrian wound up narrating the audiobook for the Final Girl support group and crushing it. We don't watch horror movies to see people die. We watch horror movies to see them survive. Let's roll the closing credits. It's time to say goodbye. And please, I want you to remember, we are all going to die and 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 die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. It's the thing we have in common, the thing we can't outrun. Dying in a car wreck or just getting too much sun. Use sunscreen, hacked up by machetes, attacked by wolverines. Maybe it's a power drill or COVID-19. Every college dorm is bloody. Every summer camp is cursed. Every frat house is a slay ground and sororities are worse. Maybe it's by heart attack, maybe by harpoon, but death is out there waiting for everybody on this Zoom. We're going to die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. So let's roll down all our windows. Let's turn off our alarms. Let's drive into the countryside and enter haunted barns. Let's investigate strange noises like a bunch of stupid jerks. Let's plan a long camping trip to where our phones don't work. And die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. There are many different ways to die, some better and some worse, but every sentient being will die across the universe. The suns will die and stars will die, babies, puppies too, whales and snails and great big pails of interstellar goo. Dummies, mummies, fluffy bunnies, those with high IQs, pretty ponies, girls named Tonys, and tiny hamsters too. Kings and queens and in-betweens, and one day, so will you. You'll die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Every single one of us will die and die and die. So thanks for coming out to see me. It's time to say farewell. We may never meet again. So I'll see you all in hell and die and die and die and die and die and die and die. Everyone on this Zoom will die and die and die. Thank you guys very much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. And try not to die out there. Good night, y'all.